Hi everyone. So today we're going to be looking at the origins of the civil rights movement. So we're getting towards the end of the course now, and we're going to look at two big different movements of people trying to get equality in America, because as we've seen throughout this course so far, there is a lot of inequality of wealth, be it between textile workers and people working on Wall Street, or African Americans and white Americans, all right, and new immigrants, old immigrants, and so on. So the origins of the civil rights movement, you've got to think, well, what drives a movement? Why do people want change? And it's a lot of the time it's because they've seen something different. So if the Second World War has a lot to do with the civil rights movement, because what we see during the Second World War is a lot of people who have gone and given their lives and risked their lives for their country, African American people, in the same way that white Americans have. And that disparity hasn't existed. They don't have segregation where they're going. So what you've got to imagine is that these African Americans grew up, a lot of them mainly poor, on farms. And before the Second World War, they wouldn't have had access to the outside world. They wouldn't have known that segregation wasn't normal, because it was the way that they had always lived. So what the Second World War does is it opens their eyes to this idea that segregation doesn't have to exist, because they go abroad to Europe, to different countries where they don't have these laws, obviously the Jim Crow laws, that have separate everything, and they see that some kind of equality is possible. So they come back and want to start fighting for it. Some do, not all of them do. But what they do notice is that when they come back from the armed forces, they're expected to just go back into their old roles. And as I said, their eyes have been opened up, and a lot of them don't want to do that. There's a really, really good film that I recommend watching, that I always watch with my classes when we're doing this, called Mudbound, and that's on Netflix. And that shows you exactly this happening. So we see an African American man going away to war, and then he comes back to this deep South state where he's treated like he's never been a hero. All right. And he experiences exactly what I've just said. So let's have a look at the big picture and where the civil rights movement actually came from. So increased expectations of changes in attitudes towards African Americans, as we've just said. So at home, 2 million African Americans worked in factories, producing war materials. So this means that they are still working towards the war effort. Okay, they're still, I don't know what's going on with this pen. They're still contributing to the war, okay? They're still serving their country, though they're not at the front, these people at this time. So we also have over 1 million African American soldiers joining or conscripted. So if you are conscripted, that means that you have compulsory military service, all right? You have to join the forces if you are conscripted. So they either volunteered or were conscripted into the US Army, and they work alongside, and this is our key word here, they work alongside white Americans, even if in a subordinate, which means less than, role. All right, so they may still be their inferior in terms of rank in the army, but they're still working together. They're still working and living and experiencing this war alongside one another, which is not common in America in peacetime. So a sizable portion was stationed in Britain between 1943 and 1944, and was shocked to find that there was no segregation there. Right, as I've said, they don't have access to TV at this point. They're not sitting around watching newsreels or films or TV programs made in Britain and seeing that we don't have segregation here. They're not exposed to that outside life, so they don't know that segregation isn't the only way to live. So it was to be expected that, having fought against a racist Nazi Germany, and this is another key thing, who were we fighting? People who were killing Black people for being Black, people who were killing Jewish people for being Jewish. If we're taking down that enemy partly because of their racial beliefs, how can we still hold these racist beliefs? And when I say we, I'm talking about the Americans there. So questions would be asked after the war about the racial inequality at home. Okay, and it very much still existed. There was still this us and them attitude from a lot of white Americans, particularly in the South. So the US Constitution, which is their sort of law book, their rule book, was supposed to guarantee that all people were treated equally. Now, we know the Jim Crow laws are not about equality, all right? So African Americans, it's clearly not the case. They are not treated equally. 17 states enforce the Jim Crow laws, right? So we don't have, they're not everywhere. Okay, and even in the 1960s, well into the civil rights movement, another brilliant film is Green Book about this sort of thing. Even into the 1960s, we still have what are called sundown states, where Black people are not allowed out after sundown, and if they are, they will get arrested, and we see an example of that in that film. Not all states enforce them, but particularly the southern states do, and they do not allow for equality. African Americans officially had the right to vote, but were prevented from registering by violence and lynchings. Okay, if you don't know what a lynching is, that's when they're hung from trees or hanged from trees. So they're intimidated into not voting. Legally, they could, but if they do, they run the risk of being hanged. So you can see that's not really an option, is it? You might as well have them not able to vote. So law officers did not prevent these attacks, but even took part in them. And this is why it's so difficult for African Americans, because a lot of the people, by no means all, who were in the KKK, who were in the Ku Klux Klan, who were targeting these Black people, were lawyers, were police officers, were judges. So the powerful people were supporting the KKK. So really the Black people felt no protection under the law. White juries almost always acquitted, which means let off whites accused of killing African Americans. All right. So if a white person killed an African American, more often than not, they wouldn't get punished for it. And then here, they were paid less for doing the same jobs as their white counterparts, and the best universities were closed to Black people. So we can see why there's an appetite for it. But again, had the Second World War not happened, this would all just seem normal. There would be no questioning of it. Where we see change and movement and this protest and this want for something different has to be born from this idea that there can be something different. So had these African Americans not gone abroad and seen that it didn't have to be this way, we may not have had a civil rights movement. So we can't underestimate the part that World War II played in that. So we're going to have a look at two different bodies here, the Fair Employment Practice Committee and then CORE, and what part they played in setting up the civil rights movement, okay, allowing it to thrive and to grow as it does. So the Fair Employment Practice Committee is there to investigate claims of discrimination. Okay, so in employment, you could say, I am not hiring you because you are Black, and they were looking into complaints against this. So Roosevelt signed an executive order, and this threatened to bring 100,000 African Americans to the nation's capital to protest racial discrimination. All right. And this is in the 1940s. So we already have some kind of appetite brewing here a few years into the, excuse me, into the Second World War. And the demonstration was called off. However, they were now holding this body accountable. All right. They want to make sure that these instances of discrimination are looked into as they're supposed to be. So they have powers from 1943 to take action against discrimination by the defense industry. So that's to do with the war, all right? So if African Americans are treated differently in the army, then this body will look into that as well. The budget is increased, so more government spending on here, and a full-time staff is hired. So they are taking it seriously, okay? Remember, Roosevelt's a progressive, he's a Democrat. So by the end of World War II, African Americans accounted for almost 8% of defense industry's jobs, and the number of Black Americans working for the federal government more than tripled Now, this is really significant, okay, because if you've got Black people in a position of power, that's going to increase their status, all right, and their standing in the whole of society. Job bias does continue, right? Just the white people will be given the higher paid jobs and the more superior jobs, just because that's what was completely normal then. They were segregated within the defence industry, paid less than their white counterparts, and restricted in their ability to join and participate in unions, all right? So anything that's fighting for their rights, they have limited support from somebody to make sure that they're being treated equally. So it was debated at the end of the war whether this should even continue, and they voted against it in 1946. So this is only during the war. Now you can see how that in itself would drive the civil rights movement. Okay, so from 1946, it's gone. And it's like, well, why did we have protection then and we don't now? Surely that protection should carry on into peacetime. So 2 bills are introduced into Congress between 46 and 48. Both failed. And in 1948, President Truman, who replaces Roosevelt, sent a civil rights package to Congress calling for a permanent one, but Congress refused to pass it. So again, as we saw, Congress opposing to the New Deal and the progression there. A lot of Congress are Republicans, and they're opposing this as well. In 1950, the House approved a permanent FEPC, but senators from the South filibustered and prevented the bill from passing. It was never made a permanent government agency. So there's appetite from it from certain politicians, but as we'll come across again and again in this part of the course, people in the South are against it, okay? And they absolutely have to have the support for it to be able to pass, okay? And then we've got the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. It's founded in 1942. So again, we can see how this is all happening during wartime. And this is an interracial, so we've got white people and Black people in this group of students in Chicago. So many students were members of the Chicago branch of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a pacifist, so against war, organization seeking to change racist attitudes. And they are deeply influenced by Gandhi's teaching of nonviolent resistance, right? And we'll see similarities there again with Martin Luther King later on in the course. So it starts as a non-hierarchical, so everybody's on the same playing field because they're after equality. Decentralization, funded entirely by the voluntary contributions of its members. It's co-led by white University of Chicago student and a Black student. So again, in the people who were setting it up, one white, one Black. And in 1942, it starts protests against segregation by organizing sit-ins, which we'll see again later on in the course. So we want non-violent direct action, which again, we're going to see with Martin Luther King later on. So sit-ins, jail-ins, and freedom rides. From the beginning, it experienced tension between local control and national leadership. So we've got this, the problem with which strategy we're going to go with. Okay, so the tension persisted throughout its early existence. It was decided that to have national impact, it was necessary to strengthen the organisation, and we've got a national director of CORE in 1953. So this lasts a significantly longer amount of time than the first one that we looked at. So in 1947, so after the wars ended, they sent 8 white and 8 Black men into the Upper South to test a Supreme Court ruling that declared segregation in interstate travel unconstitutional, right? So that means that where we had segregation, that didn't fit with the law, okay? CORE gained national attention for this. So obviously it's getting media attention. People are aware that there are people there starting to fight for the rights. And in the aftermath of Brown versus Board of Education, we're going to talk about that more in the next video. It was revived from several years of stagnation and decline, and it provided the Montgomery bus boycott. Again, I'm going to go into that in the next video, with its philosophical commitment to non-violent direct action. And it's focusing its energy in the South because that is where the racism is predominantly. So I'm just going to move down to the bottom here. So by the end of 1961, CORE had 53 affiliated chapters, and they remained active in Southern civil rights activities for the next several years. It participated in President Kennedy's voter education project, which we'll look at in future videos. President Kennedy was a supporter of the civil rights movement. And also sponsored the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King gives his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. So you can see here that they're active from the 1940s to the 1960s, and they're only getting more powerful and influential as the movement goes on. So at the bottom here, there's just a little timeline of the 1930s into the 1940s. The next video is going to focus on the 1950s because that's when we see the protests starting to come, actual constitutional change starting to arise. So in 1937, we've got a trade union for African American rail workers, right? So they've got support there, somebody fighting for their rights. There shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industry. So that's what we were talking about at the beginning. We've got a mixed race politician campaigning to allow African American journalists into the press rooms. It's crazy to us, isn't it, that they weren't allowed into press rooms. All the press were white. 1946, Truman's Committees on Civil Rights, which recommended the elimination of segregation. And then finally, in 1947, we've got Jackie Robinson left the segregated Negro National League and joined the previously white-only Brooklyn Dodgers in the National Baseball League. And soon, all major baseball teams had at least one black player. And that's towards the end of the 1940s. Okay, this is before the movement has really started. We are starting to see some kind of change in attitude, and that probably has to do in part with the Second World War. Okay, so thank you very much for joining me in this video. As I said, in the next one, we're going to focus on the development of the civil rights in the 1950s. And then later on, we'll go to look at Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So join me there. Thank you.